Afternoon now, I'm guessing, depending on where you are in the world. We're now moving into afternoon, at least here on the East Coast, that is. And I'm gonna just start now with a welcome to everyone. And just a couple of logistical notes as before we begin. We haven't disabled the chat, so you can use that space if you'd like to contribute comments, etc. However, if you have questions for the panelists, which we will get to once everybody's had a chance to answer a few of my questions, please be sure and put those in the question and answer or the Q&A box below. Our staff here will be monitoring that Q&A box, and when it comes to time for questions from the audience, that is where we will be drawing those questions from, not from the chat box. So be sure to use the Q&A box to submit your questions for the panelists. So welcome everyone. We are absolutely thrilled to host this first panel in our Women's Leadership Development series on leading in a crisis. This series came from a collaboration between the Ann Welsh McNulty Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova, which I direct, and the College of Professional Studies here, which we're working together to create a certificate program for women's leadership development, originally to be launched this fall. Well, then came a global pandemic, and like many other things, our plans had to change. I'd like to offer my thanks to Mary Alice Morrow, who coordinated these efforts, as well as the planning committee members of Jane Mullaney, Danielle Ross, Therese Narzakul, and Michelle Gianfrancaro, among many others who helped us pull this off. That committee decided that we would instead address the immediate need to understand how to lead at a time when the pressures on leaders are high, but the work of leadership is most needed, as well as the long-term need to capture the stories of women in these amazing times. It's no surprise to anybody that's done work in these fields that crises of COVID and racial injustice have had some of their greatest impacts on women as frontline workers, caregivers, and community organizers. And as we've said many times at the Institute, crises amplify inequities. And they have certainly shone a light on a lot of those inequities that women bear in our society. The leaders on this panel that you'll hear from today have taken on addressing those inequities with their own unique leadership. So let's meet them. The full bios for each of these panelists are available on the Institute's website, womensleadership.villanova.edu, which Tara will also post in the chat so people can go and read them. They are very accomplished and therefore lengthy bios, so I'm just going to give some highlights in my introductions today. We're going to start with Dr. Sandra Gomberg, MSN, who's the president of SLG-REG LLC. It's a healthcare consulting firm focusing on disruptive innovation in healthcare delivery, business models, and improving quality care. She also serves as adjunct faculty at the M. Louise Fitzpatrick College of Nursing at Villanova and is also an alum. Sandy has a long and storied career as a healthcare administrator, holding executive roles at leading health systems like Area Jefferson and Temple University, as well as serving as an executive consultant in the field. With multiple honors and executive roles under her belt, this spring, Sandy was asked to do what might have been unthinkable just 2 months prior: create a temporary hospital in a sports arena, specifically Temple's LaCouris Center, to address Philadelphia's COVID response. Next, we have Ericka Plater. Ericka is the executive director of Our Lady of Mercy Community Outreach Services, a 30-year-old nonprofit providing direct services, education, and health services to the rural sea islands of Johns, James, and Wadmalaw, as well as the east side of downtown Charleston. As a mission-driven nonprofit leader with over 25 years experience in organizational development, business and strategic planning, diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership development, program development, and training and conferences, Ericka had to channel all of this, I'm sure, into keeping Our Lady of Mercy running during quarantine, providing life-saving food and financial assistance, and serving an increasing demand for food and shelter brought on by the crisis in her community. Next, we have Debora Bossemeyer. Debora is Vice President of Global Programs at Jhpiego, which creates and delivers transformative healthcare solutions that save lives, working in partnership with national governments, health experts, and local communities to build health providers' skills and develop systems that save lives now and guarantee healthier futures for women and their families. Debora is a global leader in international public health with more than 20 years experience leading, managing, and implementing large-scale integrated health projects in Mozambique and other low and middle-income countries. Faced with this global pandemic of historic proportions, Debora has had to use her leadership to address the issue across the globe, as well as in Jhpiego's own backyard of Baltimore, Maryland. And last but certainly not least, we have Adela Mendoza, who's the Executive Director of the Hispanic Alliance of South Carolina and founder of the Student Dreamers Alliance. Adela is an international professional skilled at building strategic collaborative partnerships, facilitating cross-cultural relationships, and leading diverse teams and coalitions. As a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, and in her role as Executive Director of the Hispanic Alliance, Adela is driving systemic change to increase access to opportunity for the emerging Hispanic community. In addition to the many issues that organizations who are doing transformative change faced at this time, Adela's organization also faced the crisis of the Supreme Court challenge to the Dreamers Act and preparing that community for the potential outcomes of that decision. You can see that we asked each of these women to be on this panel because of their tremendous experience, and also that they've been living examples of the Institute's guiding principles of leadership: impact, influence, equity, and change agency. Whether their spheres are local or global, we feel that there's a lot that we can learn from their stories. So let's get right to it. We'll have questions for the panel for the next hour, and then we'll open it to everyone, and participants can submit again using the Q&A button on your Zoom. Okay, so we're going to start with Dr. Gomberg first, followed by the other panelists. In our work at the Institute for Women's Leadership at Villanova, we often talk about authentic leadership style being the most effective for each individual leader. How do you lead authentically in the work you're doing during a crisis in particular? And what personal leadership values came through the strongest in your work during this time?
Thanks, Terry. As Terry mentioned, one Thursday evening in the end of March, my phone rang, and it was the Philadelphia Health Commissioner who introduced himself and asked me if I would be able to be the CEO of the city's COVID surge facility, and to meet him the next morning in an empty basketball arena, and to imagine a hospital in the next 10 days. It was so surreal, it was actually almost funny. But the reality certainly hit me very quickly, that I would have hundreds of volunteers, staff members, police and fire, Army folks, all there, and we had to create this hospital in very short order. When you have a crisis, there aren't any rules, there aren't any guardrails, particularly crises like a global pandemic where there haven't been any prior experience to help guide your thinking. And so for me, over my career, I have built a set of, I'll say, my mantra, what I go to really help me pull my head together to say, how will I approach this crisis in an organized way? And over the years, what I've developed is the following. Always do what's in the best interest of the organization, treat people with dignity and respect, put the patient in the center, come from a place of curiosity, and money always follows quality. It is never the other way around. So when I had to make decisions, I had to go back to my center, back to those guiding principles and say, okay, is it in the best interest of this organization, this surge hospital, that we have 47 giant H tanks of oxygen, or do we need another solution? So whether it was something mechanical or a human decision, or a clinical decision, I continued back to that. The last piece I'll mention is that when you're in that leadership role in the crisis and you're trying to find your own center and checking your own authenticity, you have to create the ability to translate that to the group you're working with, to give them something authentic to hold on to. And out of my personal mantra, I proposed to the staff that we had two guiding principles. We were going to put the patient in the center and that we were going to keep the staff safe. And they were not very complicated, but every morning we huddled and said, okay, what do we do today to put the patient in the center and keep the staff safe? And as an authentic leader, by sharing your authenticity and giving your team something to hold on to, is the way to move through a crisis.
Thank you. And that concept of both patient center and individual center is really resonant. Next, we'll let Debora answer that question. Oh, you're muted, Debora.
Sorry, thank you. I was so concentrated on Sandra's response, and I think it's so amazing to have this group of people. I would say that I completely agree with that, but I would say also being a global organization, for me, one of the things that were very important at this point was like building up on our resilience as leaders, as teams, and as an organization, because as you said, when you have a global crisis like this, that it's happening at the same time everywhere, in all our country offices, in our personal lives, in our professional lives, you need to really think how you will communicate with everybody at the same time. So the first thing for me was remain calm. What we know at this point, things are changing, and then what we can communicate at this moment. So be always, I think the authentic leadership for me is to be genuine. This is what we don't know, but this is what we know. We don't know how long it will last, but these are the initial things that we can do. So not panic, not underestimating, and then giving very clear guidance on how, for example, stop traveling, stop conferences, how we work virtually in our work that we are always traveling to different locations, how we communicate in the different time zones, and how we remain true to our values and our mission, protecting also our organizational values and mission.
For sure. Ericka, how about you?
Well, I think it's a similar story on the front end. We too were trying to figure out what do we do and how do we get ready for COVID as we realized it was coming closer and closer to us in South Carolina. And, I am really intentional about how I show up as a leader on a daily basis. And with my team, we are really focused on being that one band, that one sound. And so we really use that leadership, that team model and the leadership model of authenticity and how we connect with each other as part of COVID. And so for me personally as a leader, there's a couple of mantras I too follow that I really pulled on for this situation. And one was that it's always people first. Whether it's my staff or whether it's those we serve, it's always people first. So it's how are we going to help those who are really going to need us now more than ever before. The second part to that is that there are never obstacles, there are only opportunities. So looking at every situation we faced as an opportunity, do something different, do something new, learn something, and overcome the obstacles and the barriers that were in front of us as we try to navigate COVID, and being able to keep our doors open to serve people who are coming to us in droves, needing food, needing unemployment assistance, and even needing financial assistance. I say the next one is both personal and as a leader, I really try to do no harm. So everything I do is about adding and being a benefit to others, whether it's my staff, my community, my clients, anyone. So it's about do no harm. How can I help alleviate? My staff were under a lot of pressure personally, and I was trying to keep people employed and keep the doors open. So how did I do that without doing any harm? And the last one is really about triaging. As a leader, when situations pop up in a crisis like this, I really go to, first I freak out, oh my gosh, what's going on? But then I go to, what's the problem? What's the solution? What are the resources I need in order to move forward through the crisis?
And I think the freak out is part of the authentic, right?
Yes,
Right?
it is.
If I'm going to pretend I'm not freaking out right now, then I'm not necessarily being authentic, because this is something none of us have faced before, at least in our lives, right?
Oh, very true.
Adela, how about you?
Well, that was a perfect segue to what I was going to say, because I think that authenticity comes from being transparent, right? And I think that if there was ever a time where people needed authenticity, is now. I mean, one thing that we all have seen is this environment is changing and it will continue to change. And I think that's exactly what the challenge is for us, that just when you feel like you have finally found a way to navigate this crisis, we just keep getting this wavy road that doesn't seem to end. And I think that if there was ever a time where authenticity was almost like a currency, is now. When you think about it, no one has all the answers. And I just love the transparency of these amazing women to say, we have to embrace the fact that we just don't know what's going to happen next. All we have is people's trust, and we need to leverage that to sort of, guide our way out of this. But we can't do it alone. And so I love that we're starting this conversation with a focus on authenticity, because I think that the values that Villanova University is championing, they're all connected by that. And I just love the idea, for me, for us as leaders, we need to remember that every person in our team has an endless potential to make an impact. That's a given, and we need to believe it. But to achieve that, we have a responsibility to open platforms for them to lead. And that means that sometimes we need to follow. And to me, that is at the core of authentic leadership. We have to recognize when we cannot lead or we don't know how to lead best, but someone else in our team may. And for that, we need to build that agency of to lead change that you guys talk about. And that leads to equity. So to me, if we nurture authentic leadership and we not nurture the capacity of other women, especially, to lead in this space, that is a roadmap out of this crisis.
Great. I'm going to get you to write more for our website about our guiding principles that way. You captured it perfectly for us. So I'm hearing that in particular, part of that authenticity and transparency comes through in how we communicate. And Debora, in our next question, a leader by definition has responsibility to others, right? Be it on their team, in their organization, or in their community. But communication is an absolutely key component of that responsibility, especially as you all have already noted, things are constantly changing. There are so many unknowns. How do you support those people in your leadership, and how do you communicate when you don't know anything?
Thank you. So I would say you're completely right that absolutely communication probably perhaps is the most essential leadership skill and asset that you have in a time of crisis. And just to give a little bit more context, in my role, so I oversee a team in the US, that is our backstopping team, about like 60 plus people, but I also oversee our 40 offices in different countries across the globe, and time zones and languages. And strangely enough, obviously, because of the nature of our work, we work always under crisis, right? We have a cyclone, or we are serving the most vulnerable population, and we have like a huge like insurgence of violence, or we have other endemic areas and we have an outbreak. But in this case, we were all caught together. All our teams here, as I mentioned before in my first talk, all together at the same time. And we had to, my responsibility was to ensure that they were safe, but also to protect our livelihoods, right? Their livelihoods. So how we ensure business continuity, how we work in multiple teams to be able to address that. So for me, communication was essential key. So we work in teams of teams so that we could organize ourselves, and we immediately set, from what we knew. So the first thing, we travel a lot for work, and we work in several different offices in different countries. So what are the things that we can continue to do? What are the things we need to stop to do immediately? How we'll be communicating if we are isolated in different circumstances? Do we need to shut down the offices all at the same time? If we do, how we keep our mission? Our mission in Jhpiego as an organization is doesn't matter where a woman lives, that shouldn't determine if she lives or dies. So our work in maternal health, in family planning, in HIV, how we also kept the services, the most essential services to our audience, to our beneficiaries. So we had a dilemma, a balance to make, our safety and the services to our communities, most of them women as well. So we created a task force that will be addressing the country teams. The country teams also created their own focal points. We create a WhatsApp that we could have contact with all the country offices, so any emergencies. And we created several channels of communication. So if one way wasn't working, how we could have another way of communication that we could make sure that we're safe. Then as we knew more about how things were evolving, we initially thought it was 2 weeks or 3 weeks or maybe a month working from home. We also start seeing what are the inequalities of access to communication, working from home, taking care of kids, doing homeschooling, not only here in the US, but also in all the other countries, and how we need to support the different challenges and needs from each one of our teams. And I will stop ending saying that, most important than starting addressing the communication in the beginning of the crisis is how we evolve and how we follow up, how we are available all the time, how we make, how we see how things are progressing and keep adjusting and adapting our plans to move forward with our mission.
I like that. That's a very tactical approach there. Ericka, how about you and your communication strategies?
One of the first things I said to my staff when COVID hit was that I don't have all the answers, that we would make a lot of changes, a lot of pivots in the direction we would go in, but to just trust that the intention was always about doing what was best for the organization, for the staff, and for the community. And the one thing I could tell them is that something like the pandemic is what we were actually built for. This is why we're here. This is why it's important for us to show up to our community right here, right now. And so as we've gone through the last 6-7 months of this situation where every day is something new, it's a new adventure, it's a new challenge, a new decision, a new direction, I focused a lot on over communicating. I've done a lot more shared decision making, shared leadership, as we've talked about a little bit already. I listen a lot more. I think I'm a good listener and an active listener, but during COVID, I listen a lot deeper and a lot more often. I talk a little less. I invite input and feedback from others so that we're building solutions together as a team for the organization. And I've just been very honest, I'd say, throughout the whole process. Adela talked about transparency as being a part of authenticity. And I think through COVID, we all have had to just be very honest and very transparent about what was happening and the directions we've been going in. And for us, that's worked out really well with the team. And I think it's actually allowed the team to then communicate differently and more openly and more frequently, both within their teams and across teams. So it's actually been a great benefit for us, but over communicating is not always a bad thing.
For sure. Adela, how about you?
So you kind of stole my thunder, because what you said is exactly how I have now reflecting on how we have dealt with this pandemic. Is it is easy now to go back and rescue lessons learned and pinpoint to our mistakes. But I think that a challenge in communication has to be creating the space for honest communication to happen. And I think that is easier said than done. One thing is to be open to feedback and to be open to ideas, but a very different thing is to be intentional at communicating to your team. Our team happens to be all women, and that was not by design. It just has happened this way. And we are, and I think that very often we feel the pressure to overperform because we navigate a world that is mostly led by men, especially here in the South. And it is very hard for us to find spaces where we can be vulnerable and we can truly communicate that we're struggling. And just because I can remember a time where all hands on deck were necessary, but many of us have had to rely on, smaller teams to do bigger things. And that comes with a crushing weight that no human being should be able to, should have to deal with alone. So I think that in addition to the transparency that we need to be willing to model for our teams, we have to be also forgiving and listen intently. People will tell you when they want to lead and when you need to lead them. But it is up to us to listen for the words or listen for the actions. And I think that women are naturally good at, you know, having those instincts when we can recognize that someone is asking for help, but they may be embarrassed to ask for help. So I think for me, that has been a huge lesson to learn, that I need to learn to listen beyond words and be intently in my approach and be kind and celebrate vulnerability, because that makes us grow.
And I love that each of you have mentioned listening in your communication strategies, because we tend to think of communication as coming out of us, not us taking in, and listening is absolutely key. Sandy, how about your take on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to use a story from the surge facility to kind of illustrate what you just spoke about, Terry. We were about 7 days into creating this hospital in this basketball arena with this really kind of new and unknown interdisciplinary group of people. And I mentioned earlier that we would huddle in the morning and huddle in the afternoon, and I would ask, say, we're going to put the patient in the center and take care of the staff. And so people would start to come to me and say, somebody doesn't think we're ready, and somebody else doesn't think we're ready. So I said, okay. So I pulled the whole group together and I said, okay, gave out paper to everybody and said, all right, everybody write down on a piece of paper what you think we're not ready to do. How are we not gonna take good care of patients? And we made a big fishbowl. And I did it anonymously, a beginning, because they were really stressed. They didn't want to let me down. They didn't want to let the city or the patient who needed us down. And so they put all of their answers into this fishbowl. And so after looking at them, there was really two themes. One about questions that I didn't have answers to quick enough, on how are we going to keep the staff safe, and what was our PPE plan, which literally changed by the hour, and how are we going to keep the staff safe. And so at that point, I needed, as you guys had just all described, I needed to say to them, look, I don't have all of these answers. These are great questions. And so we're going to make a list of these questions and we're going to work through them. And we might not have all the answers before the first patient comes. And we're committed to do it. So from that day on, I added to that daily, twice a day huddle, we're going to do its best interest of the organization and keep the patient safe. And at the end of every meeting, I said, does anybody have a patient safety concern? And does anybody have a staff safety concern? And because we went over that hump together, then people would actually say it in the group and say, I'm still worried about drug delivery. I'm still worried about safety. And so you as a leader in these unknown circumstances need to kind of acknowledge that unknown, but shift your strategy so that you can bring that group along in understanding how to speak up and speak out, so it's not that they're going to get in trouble. And you as a leader, as Adela, you said sometimes you have to lead and sometimes you have to listen, and they were craving to be led because they were really scared. Me too, but I had to come through and think of a different way to approach them.
And your comments, Sandy, really help lead into that next question that I have for each of you. And that's, we're now more than 6 months into this pandemic. And those also added intensified movements around racial and social justice and all of the other things that have kind of come to light as a result of the stress that's come out of the pandemic. And there's a lot of research that's beginning to come out of the impacts of these and the long-term nature of it. And in fact, even this morning, I have 2 young children, and they were talking about how stressed they were. And Mommy, when am I going to be able to go back to normal? What is that? It's been 6 months without that. So I guess the long-term nature of these crises and their impact on our mental and physical health. How do you, and this is such a great question for women, and Adela, I'm going to pose it to you first. How do you care for yourself in these times so you can maximize your effectiveness as a leader? And then also, how do you encourage others to do the same? But you have to answer the first question first, okay? Because that's always the challenge for women, right? We're good at 2, but not number 1.
Exactly. And by the way, I'm notoriously good at not being very good at taking care of myself, but I am very good to my team. And so I think that I think we will all remember this as a year of change, whether imposed or voluntary. And I think that's where the healthy tension lays in how to approach this, right? So I've built this culture where every person in my team feels comfortable coming to me or coming to another person and asking honestly for help or acknowledging that we don't know. So I think that I, in the beginning, felt that would be enough. But as soon as I think the world and the US realized that this was something huge that we had never dealt with, one thing that I recognized very quickly is that even though we were experiencing the same pandemic, no one was experiencing the same way. And it just became crystal clear that in addition to the morning huddles that we do, to the weekly staff meetings that we do, and all of these, intentional spaces for conversation, we had to come up with something different that will allow my team to almost process. Because if you remember, we are processing all of these 6 months into the pandemic. But when all of this started in March, there was so much uncertainty, and it was a perfect storm because at least for us as a small nonprofit still dealing with huge issues in advocacy and crisis intervention, etc., we suddenly were looking at each other, not knowing where to start. And we realized that unless we center ourselves, it was going to be very difficult for us to lead. I live in the South, which has been historically dominated by a binary conversation, black and white. And then we're seeing this expansion or explosion of multiculturalism. And at the center of that sits our organization, which is a Hispanic alliance that brings together a very diverse network. So all eyes are on you, and there is nothing scarier than that. When we are human beings, and I think, so what I'll say is, very quickly we realized we needed to have a space where we could talk about anything other than work. And I know this may sound counterintuitive, but I will very much encourage everyone who's listening to do this, because we started having conversations every Friday afternoon. And that was a very intentional time, because what I wanted was for us as a team to check in with each other. And I really used a lot of the readings that I've been fortunate to find through Aspen, through the seminars. And during that conversation, we got to a depth of vulnerability and understanding of each other that allowed us to sort of put the week away and focus on our weekend. And so we found a structure where we had to prevent work to bleed into this space, which may sound absolutely strange, but I cannot emphasize how useful that was for our next week. People were given that, especially we as women want to take care of our community, and it's impossible. And so we were able to come into our weekends with the permission to take care of ourselves, to spend time with our loved ones, to take care of our children, anyone. And we came on Monday with a sense of renewed commitment that I wish I could claim that I knew that would be the outcome, but I didn't. And I am so grateful for that we've continued to do it. And so what I will say for anyone who may, and I'm, by the way, available to talk to anyone about how we did it and some of the conversations that we used. The team started contributing the questions that they wanted asked during the conversations. But it's important to structure it. It's important to have your questions prepared. It's important to be consistent, to have it every Friday. No matter how busy the work is, we did it. And I honestly believe that that's what's helped us navigate this with a sense of unified resilience.
Right, creating that acknowledgement that we're all not automatons able to go through and do what we need to do here. That acknowledgement of the life side of work and life, if you will.
Normalize fear and anxiety and insecurity. Normalize it because we're human beings. And once that you normalize it and put it on the table, you can move on to growth.
Ericka, how about you? Because your space, your community, the work that you're doing is also absolutely critical to life too, right? So it's kind of a double stressor that way.
It is in a lot of ways, and wanting to be there and show up for the community all the time. Not just me, but my staff are very mission driven too. So they also want to make sure they're doing everything they can for the community. So I'll get the hardest question out the way first, which is my self-care. All I can really say is that my self-care Sunday routines that I usually do have really been amped up and they're spilling over into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So I really am making sure I'm doing things for myself every day, because that's the only thing I can truly control right now, is how I take care of myself, make sure my cup is full so that I can fill others' cups. And so I really have, I do everything from quick breathing techniques, meditation. I do puzzles a lot. I'm back into reading. I do a lot of walking and time by bodies of water and nature. And I take breaks even at work. I'll go and I'll hide at the park that's down the street from where we work, because there's a pond there. And I'll hide there for lunch and just take a quick 15, 20-minute break. And then I come back and I'm ready to jump back in. When it comes to taking care of my team, we've been trying to do a lot of temperature checks at every meeting. We start with, how are you? Let's not talk about work, but how are you doing? What's going on? In my one-on-ones with my staff, I'm always asking those questions. I'm asking about how the rest of the staff is doing. What do we need to do to help everyone? Mentally, we're providing a lot of communications to staff around making sure they're seeking mental health support where they can, however they can, to help them through this process. And we offer some of that through our healthcare benefits. So we do a lot of those kind of, things that you can touch and feel. But another way I feel as I've been really trying to take care of people as a leader in the organization is just trying to understand and be empathetic and be compassionate and be flexible for my team, because they're navigating situations with ailing parents, situations with young children, their own situations, or loved ones and partners that were laid off during COVID. And that's just COVID. There's also life that happened before COVID. So just having that flexibility, that understanding, and we've done a lot of trying to have fun. We actually set up a parking lot after work get together for staff to just come, and we spaced out in the parking lot of our campus just so we could sit and talk and have food and break bread and have drinks and get to know each other and spend time not focused on the work. So we have a real priority around having fun and doing things that are not work related.
And doing that in a way where you're still safe, but you're filling that void that social distancing, I think, has created for a lot of us.
And it brings the personal back into the work, because we are people first. And so it brings that, how do we connect as people before we get back into the really hard work that we're doing that's burning us out.
And I loved your concept at the very beginning that I can control how full my own cup is, because I feel that oftentimes what I hear, particularly from women, but from a lot of people, is that they feel out of control over their own stresses. And that's a unique flip to it, which I think is helpful. Sandy, how about you and the work? And again, critical life-saving issues here.
Absolutely. I would bet that my colleagues on this panel would otherwise not publicly acknowledge weaknesses while leading through a crisis. And so when we were doing the COVID surge hospital, we worked, my leadership team and I worked about 37 days straight, 12-hour shifts. And you were constantly worried. I mean, I had patients sleeping in a basketball hospital. So, you put your head on the pillow and you own that responsibility. So it doesn't leave you when you leave. So I was completely confident that by the time that was done, everything was great. And then Villanova's College of Nursing is doing something called a CHAMPS survey, and it's surveying nurses and other direct care providers, first responders, about how they feel about their physical and their mental output. So, as an alum, I got the email. I'm like, I'll fill it out. I wanted to get their number. So I fill this out and I'm clicking through, and all of a sudden I was like, I wonder if that's why I feel like I do, so recognize you need to do something starts with recognizing that you have a problem, right? And so that was probably the first time for me that I took a step back and said, wow, that was so hard that I really need to take some time. And I realized that I needed to take, it probably took me about 6 weeks after that intensity to feel like I was back in my own space. And my husband and colleagues kept saying, "Can you do this?" And I said, "No, you know what, I need some space." And so for us as women leaders, sometimes we often don't even recognize it, let alone admit that we've gotten, our tank got over full and we need to like pull it together. So I think the COVID construct and the fact that we collectively in healthcare have been pretty open about there is mental and physical sequelae that are affecting all of us has really helped. But I think as women leaders, we need to help support each other in that recognition.
Absolutely. Debora.
I think you all said like lots of things that I was thinking as well, and that happened to us. I think in my case, we went especially from the US teams, except the team that start doing the contact tracing for Baltimore, all of us went to being always traveling and on the go to be absolutely 100% virtually. And I think we all, in the beginning, were like, we have to do it. We need to keep things working. And we were really worried about how things will unfold in our countries, but also, you know, as an organization. So very easily and very quickly, we realized everybody was working 12, 14 hours a day, you know, starting super early and also over communicating, not in the sense of over communicating like the important information, but, you know, trying to do many things that I think as in our spirit and in our self-driven, you know, we need to fix it. We need to do things. And then I quickly realized that will not be sustainable. Right, and it was a long shot. It wasn't something to come here for a few weeks or a month, and no, we'll be that for in the long haul. So I start super early, but then at 5 or 4:30 p.m. I'll just go for a walk. I had to get out of the house, get some sun, just like clear my mind, and then I could come back and work again. You know, if I had to continue with another group, I would do that. The other thing is I start exercising as soon as I could again, because that for me, it's the only way to really have my mind disconnected with all the multiple thoughts that we're having at the same time. And then to realize that, yes, we can take time off. We have to, even if we take like a half day. And then I start telling my team, you know, this is what we need to do. And if I don't do, they also will not do. So to really say, guys, we are not superheroes here, right? We need to all take care of ourselves. And as you mentioned, several of you mentioned, we start talking more about our personal lives, our worries, trying to understand more what was going on with, you know, everybody has a different personal issue or a family issue that they are concerned about, and both here and in the countries. So I think the first thing is to recognize, then to allow yourself to do it, and then you become actually more optimistic. You can see the light in the end of the tunnel, right? You can have fresh ideas, you can think differently. And also I was then more able to see, you know, what others are doing that I could also share, that they can share among each other to see, okay, this is working here, lessons learned from personally or countries that they could share and help each other and how to continue.
So that communication comes back into play.
Yes.
I think that's really interesting, the way, and many of you talked about that, imposing a structure, because I think the structure that many of us relied on to have time for ourselves, like weekends or evenings, right, where you could compartmentalize, I go to the office, I come home, or, you know, like you don't have that anymore. And taking permission to take off seems weird because you don't feel like you were on, but you're on all the time. And, you know, so having to reimpose that structure for yourself and for your team becomes very critical. Ericka, I'm going to start with our last question, which, you know, a lot of what we've dwelled on have been, you know, those really intense stressors or critical aspects, but while those crises create our most difficult challenge, it also, you know, it pulls us between that hope and despair at the same time, as it generates some of our greatest innovations and the potential for long-term change. And as we talked about, that guiding principles, that concept of change agency leading to equity is really where the Institute is focused. So how do you focus on that hope part of it? And what have you seen as opportunities for positive change that are coming out of these crises that are facing us right now?
Focusing on hope is actually hard. I think I ebb and flow on that, like many other things. But I will say one of my techniques is, even if I don't fully believe it, I still say it. So I say it's going to get better. I say we're going to work it out. I say we're, all those things, because if you say it and you affirm it, then you will manifest it. It's about whether you let the mood drive your experience, or do you let the experience drive your mood? And so for me, that's a lot of what I do when it comes to trying to hold on to hope. And with my team, I remind them that they're not in this alone. You're never alone. You're not the only one that feels the way you do. We're sorting through this together. And so if you need anything, make sure you ask for what you need. There's a whole Kenyan proverb that I really like that talks about how a bundle of sticks is unbreakable. So if we come together and do this together, we will be okay. That's also one of our greatest lessons out of this, I think, is that it's actually made us a stronger team. It's made us a better team because we've had to work together in ways we've never worked together before. I had my dental assistants were at the soup kitchen making lunch and giving it out to our community members along with my education staff. So it put us in very different circles together, we helped to know each other better. We work differently to better together, and we are a better team. I think also coming out of COVID, there's truly been disruptive innovation, as Dr. Sandra has talked about, and we have learned how to do a lot of our programs very differently, which actually broadens access, believe it or not, so that new and different people can reach us that probably never could reach us before. It also allows us to modernize. We've been modernizing a lot of the things we're doing, and this has sped up that process of evolution for us around modernization and the use of technology to do what we're doing. And we've been able to simplify. I'm all about efficiency. I'm all about effectiveness as a leader and making sure everything we do fits into one of those buckets. And so being able to simplify and use the KISS method just to get us through the crisis will actually end up being a long-term positive result for us overall. So between focusing on the positives of what's coming out of this for the team, for the work we're doing, for the community, we have much greater awareness in the community than we had before COVID. And that's been a struggle for us even after being around for 30 years. And so all of those things together, focusing on that has actually been most beneficial for us in being able to hold on to hope.
Good. Adela, how about you?
Yes, I mean, definitely as I said before, I think that this year is the only constant is change. And I once heard someone say, change happens at the speed of relationships. And I think that's the lesson that we need to take away from here. So I think that we've all seen the shift in credibility or leadership in our country, in our spheres, and those leaders that are able to appreciate the opportunity that this crisis has brought are the ones that are leading the future. And what I mean by that is, so we know that there are minority communities that are being disproportionately affected by COVID. All of the things that we are observing are not, all of these are realities we already knew. These are things we've been observing for many years. This is nothing new. It just has been revealed and highlighted. And, it's impossible not to see it anymore. But I think the conversation that we have to have as leaders is not how do we rebuild those systems? How do we put the system back together? But rather, how do we reinvent those systems that didn't work for people in the first place? And I think that's personally one of the greatest opportunities that I see for us. It's a huge challenge as well, because crises bring the best and the worst in people. So navigating that, negotiating when to have that dialogue of we're focused on the crisis, and that's important. We must feed people. We must keep people healthy. With the conversation, balancing that with the conversation of when are we going to start dreaming of the systems that have to be built so that we are better prepared for crisis, but that we can also respond to crisis in a way that not only keeps people from falling through the cracks, but lifts people to lead, because I believe every person has the potential to lead. And I'm a firm believer that people closer to the issues are people who are closer to the solution. And so I think that for me, that's exactly where we are, negotiating that conversation of addressing the immediate crisis, but let's start talking about how do we build better systems.
Right. And so even like you said, you're shining a light on issues that are concerns, but some of those systems, like when we talked about going back to school in the fall and childcare, like those are just two huge system examples. And then healthcare too, right? Like these are huge things that we're like, oh my gosh, we have no resilience in those systems. And part of that is because those systems need to be overhauled in order to address these issues. There was no resilience there because there were critical issues.
And you know what, the opportunities, what are those leaders that have the mental and emotional space to advocate for that change? Because someone has to advocate. And I think that that's where the opportunities, especially for women, to step up and say, okay, there is a better way to build these systems.
That's part of why I'm here, right? Debora, how about you? And then we'll end with Sandy.
Unmute myself. Well, first, I think I'm optimistic. So I think that helps me a lot during crisis. But I would say that for me, this crisis showed and make the globe to somehow look very small. And we became much closer. And I think as inequities were more highlighted, because I think we all were pausing at the same time, I think that will amplify the changes in the future. I think, as Adela mentioned, we all knew nothing that we are seeing now with the social justice is new. But I think for the first time, everybody is seeing it's on our face everywhere, right? So I think for me, I have a big hope that we really will become, will be a transformational change, in the coming years. The other thing is, I think in our work, for example, I think we became closer and we broke silos. I think many times we have, this team talks about this other team talks about that. Who is in charge? It's like our small kingdoms. And I think this crisis brought all of us together and broke a lot of silos and protocols. And I think that's amazing and something that will accelerate, I think, changes and innovations for the years to come. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Good. We need optimism. Sandy.
Yeah, I firmly believe that the gap between hope and despair is feeling valued. And I also believe that the singular way that we feel valued is through gratitude. And so when we had people in the COVID surge facility working crazy hours, doing crazy jobs, I knew that they were kind of looking over their shoulder, wondering if what they were doing was making a difference. Is what they were doing worthwhile? Was their extraordinary sacrifices being recognized? And so in a crisis situation, you have to handle that a little bit differently. And so there, for example, I had them put up flip charts and tie markers to them, like literally on the walls of the basketball arena. And I asked everybody to start to put up their super sparkly alerts, that's what I called them, put up gratitudes, right? And so it would be like, yo, Joe got his toilet paper. I mean, it was basic stuff. But everybody continued to put gratitudes up there. And then as just naturally, as we were doing those huddles, I would say, anybody have any announcements? It was, hey, I'd like to acknowledge Joe for being able to get the toilet paper, right? And so it started to bleed in, and people's capacity to turn their frown upside down, to have positive energy, really shifted. I think as women leaders, we have an obligation to teach gratitude for ourselves and for other people. Because when you give gratitude, you have to be feeling valued because somebody took the time out to do something to make you feel like you want to give that gratitude. And the person to whom you're giving the gratitude feels valued because they didn't know you noticed. So in my other leadership role as a faculty member in the Doctor of Nursing Practice program, at the end of every class, I stop with about 4 minutes and I say, okay, and they all start to smile at me because they figure it out after a while. And I said, okay, you know, you have the privilege to be in class, but your moms and dads and you're working and you got COVID and you're teaching your kids at home. Like, just take a minute before we end and think about who you can thank before you put your head on the pillow. One text, one call, one emoji. Who can you express gratitude to? Because it fills up your tank and it fills up their tank. And I think that is women leaders. I think we've got an inside track on gratitude and really bridging despair to hope.
Sandy, I have to say, I'm like, so right now I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing these insights, because I think that has filled up a lot of the tanks that are on listening to each of you right now. And I see people are starting to put questions in the Q&A section, and I'm going to open it up to that and ask Tara, I believe, is going to help us with kind of finding those questions for the panelists. And so if you're a participant and you're listening and you have a question for the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A. and then so we'll take the questions from the audience, and then I'm going to ask each of you, probably somewhat similar to Sandy's comment about gratitude, but each of your comments, to end that at as close to 1:30 as possible with your one thing that you want your participants to take away from this conversation to help each of them who are looking to lead for themselves or build their own leadership skills. What would you be taking for them? So, all right. So one of the questions is, are there any thoughts from any panelists, in particular Sandy, for those who are involved in mobilizing startup initiatives to support the education system, teachers, parents, and students, and the gaps and challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis? You know, so you're again, similar to what I said earlier, it's a system issue, right? So healthcare had to do something here, but what do we do about education? Are there lessons that we can be learning from each of the things that we've been talking about that we could help out there?
Wow, that is a powerful question. And so in mobilizing startups, so a couple pieces. I do have the privilege to be part of a healthcare startup, and in general, I would say to my colleagues, there is lots of room for women leaders to come and participate in thinking creatively about how we leverage the opportunities right now. As Debora said, all the silos have been broken down and people are willing to think outside the box, and women leaders are needed at that space. I think as it relates to my role as an educator, I have taken lots of opportunities to optimize learning through the COVID experience. And I think that we as faculty members and teachers, and informally and formally, can create what I call, teachable moments at all realms, and using COVID very constructively. I actually had a chance to teach one of the MBA health economics classes, and I switched all of the content and the assignments. So we were looking at the financial impact of COVID in supply chain and the financial impact of COVID in the telecom business. And so we can use that formally and informally as part of how we move forward. I don't think we should be afraid of it because, as my colleagues have said, the world is different and we're not going back.
That's a great response. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Because I think it's something that we're definitely facing as a society right now.
Yeah,
I think I would like to, please.
Go ahead, Adela.
Okay, so the only thing that I will add is, so our organization started as a volunteer organization. And when we evolved enough to become a collective impact sort of, convener, one of the things that made us successful versus others was that our approach was all about people. Literally, like Sandy said at the beginning, is people, put people at the center of your mission and your programs. And so if you are in the startup phase, do not underestimate how powerful it is to elevate the voices of those impacted by, there's a reason you're starting this movement. There is a reason why it's needed. Elevate voices of those who need help or who need to be empowered to lead.
I was actually going to say something fairly similar is, there's the whole nothing for us without us, and making sure you're including those voices in the startup phase. I find in the South Carolina area where I am in Charleston in particular, there's a lot of interest and support in the community, whether it's senior citizens, whether it's just local businesses and others who want to support children and who are in the education system right now, especially because of COVID. And so being able to get out and kind of beat the streets, as they say, to talk to people, to find out who's interested, who wants to volunteer, who has the time to give. With folks working from home, they have a lot more flexibility. Parents are really struggling with how to support each other and themselves and their children, and to juggle all their other responsibilities. So I think you will find groups of people who would be more than willing to volunteer and be a part of the startup phase, but it is about you going to look for them and not expecting them to come to you.
That's great. And I think one of the main criticisms I heard to our response to the education solutions for the fall was that we weren't listening to parents, particularly moms. But we weren't listening to them. And we also weren't listening to the teachers too, right? So, people were thinking system, but not thinking about the main actors in play there.
And they're not, and it's not child-centered. It's not the children, no one's listening to the children. If you're gonna do online learning, there should be gaming and other components involved that actually match how children nowadays who grow up with iPads, how they learn, how they socialize, how they, how they function is very different than how I did growing up. And so even the models we're using virtually really reflect what's in the classroom, which doesn't always work in a virtual environment.
Exactly. Another question we had is actually something that is very resonant with the work that the Institute does, and that is that people who aren't in formal leadership roles, which I think is very true of a lot of women leaders, right? Women tend to not identify with the term leader, in part because they're underrepresented in many of those former leadership roles, but they're also doing leadership. So what advice would you have for somebody who's not in a formal leadership role, but wants to take on that leader role with their peers, or be a leader in their peer group? So Debora, we'll hear from you first. If you have, if not, I can punt to somebody else. So
no, I believe that's a very important point and a very important question. And I think no leaders become a leader from one day to the other, right? I think exercising our leaderships and recognizing our skills, different skills as a leader, formally or informally, it's first, like in the first step. Second is, I think more and more, there are lots of different concepts of leadership and resilience. I think the formal leaders are becoming, or should be becoming, less in building groups and teams and a more resilient leadership or groups or organizations is, I think, very, very important. And I think we are seeing now, because many times, can be here, can be with our families. If there is a crisis, how we step up and do that, or if we are isolated, so how we bring that into play. I think that's a very, very important question. And I think the first thing is believe that you are a leader, and you just need to find, your what is your leadership style and skills, and what do you think you have to contribute to your team, and what, how you start exercising that in a more meaningful way, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually one of the things at the end, we'll talk about the certificate program that the Institute is offering, but that's a key aspect of the work that the Institute is going to be doing on the women's leadership development is what does your leadership vision look like? How do you form that? How do you begin to set goals and execute that vision? Anyone else on the advice for somebody who's not in a formal leadership role?
What I would say. No,
Sorry.
you're going first.
I have to say though, we're all comporting ourselves way better than last night's debate. So at least
Yes. I would agree. I would agree with that comment. Model what you would want to see in a leader. I think that's important as someone who doesn't have formal leadership, but who really wants to, if you want it, own your space, model what you want to see, and make sure you are proactively leading. So look for the opportunities to ask questions, to provide input, and to take the leadership in small projects in some way to help grow your leadership. That's what I was going to say.
Great. Adela, did you have something to add or?
Something small, but I think is significant. As leaders, when you're in a position of leadership, give your team permission to fail. That's so important. I think innovation happens when we take risks, and success happens when our leaders allow us to fail, allow us to, reroute if necessary. And I think that's at the core of growth and dignity in leadership. There's a danger in being punitive in our feedback. And I think that a true leader builds other leaders. And I think that only happens when you allow your team or you encourage your team to sometimes just to take chances and be there to back them up.
And I think that's an absolutely critical point, Adela, because we know, again, I'm going to put my academic hat on here. There's a lot of research that shows that we don't give women critical feedback, right? That we tend to only be supportive and it, as you hit the nail on the head, learning happens through failure, right? And through getting that critical feedback. And that is something that a lot of researchers have said is one of the reasons that we don't see women leaders advance, because they don't get that critical feedback. They don't have those opportunities to fail, or they're afraid to fail because they're afraid that the repercussions are going to be greater on their career than others. And I think being in that role where you talk about failure as not only possible, but potentially encouraged, because then you learn more. And I think this year in a lot of ways has been a great space for that to happen.
Can I just add to that one real quickly is embracing conflict. I think for women, that's also difficult for us, is to actually embrace conflict, not see it as a negative, but see it as a constructive tool towards resolution, innovation, and other positive outcomes. And so we as leaders, as women, have to get better at embracing conflict and putting ourselves in places of conflict as well.
And that actually is something that the workshop that will follow this on communication will look at in that negotiation piece, right? Which is inherently conflict, and communicating and negotiating. How do we do that in a time of crisis when conflict is everywhere, right?
One quick comment on that. I think that all of this can be achieved through the building of a culture where your staff understands, your team understands that a way of showing that I care about you, a way that I show my love for you, is to give you honest feedback. Because if you know that I'm giving feedback to you that may sound critical and may be difficult to accept in the moment, but if I have no uncertainty that your intention is to build me up, then we're more likely to listen to that feedback. I have benefited from mentors that are critical in the best possible way, more than I have benefited from people who tell me what I want to hear.
Definitely. We had another question from somebody who really liked your example, Debora, of breaking the silos. And I think that's happened in a lot of our workplaces and community structures, et cetera. And they asked to hear a little more about how do you actually do that? Because that's something I think that's a big, like our whole structure is silos. How do we actually break that down?
I think that's a very important and relevant discussion. And I think all these points are these dots are connected. I think many times we think about our organigrams, right? We think about like the hierarchical structure of an organization or a team, and positions. And I think the most important thing is what we want to accomplish. What is our mission? It's what is our leadership or our goals should be for something that's common. So are we thinking about, many times I see nurses, I'm a nurse by training, but I see nurses, they are taking decisions, making critical decisions every day, but they don't believe they're leaders. Because, let's say the doctor is the one in charge. Mm-hmm. But how will we make things, and if you are in a position of a leadership, your position is always temporary. Your leadership can be permanent. I think that's the way that I see leadership. And how, if you have an opportunity and I was talking to one of my colleagues today, and he was giving me an example, because we're having this discussion for a long time, how we are less hierarchical and more action-oriented, driving-oriented, and mission-driven. So for example, to say, I can be a formal leader in my team, but if I really understand and know my team members, and I see there are different moments that what they know and their experience is more relevant than mine. So how I promote, and I accept that person now is leading us in that team. So it's not your position, but your function in that context, in that moment. So how we foster more a teamwork and a more shared leadership. Then, I'm the leader, I'm the boss here because my title says so, more than how and I think just to go back to some of the questions in the authenticity, is sometimes a formal leader try to find a way how I act as a leader. And our team is very easy to recognize when we are being genuine or not. And they respect much more if you are, more introvert, but you are open, you are frank. You tell them, look, I'm not a very good in speaking like in big groups, but I'm here for you guys. You can. So I think, being ourselves is the first step, and understanding how we lead, and that we can do that in a team, not individually only.
Excellent. Your team isn't your silo. Your team is bigger. Sandy, you were saying something.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of offer, a kind of a homework assignment for folks who are on the call who really want to practice some skills. And the first thing you have to do is go on YouTube and watch an episode of Columbo. Now, Columbo is one of my favorite leadership examples, and many of our younger generation colleagues haven't had the privilege of seeing Columbo, and so he's this scrunchy old, not really old, but he's a scrunchy guy who is a police inspector, and he's always investigating something, and he's always scratching his head. It's one more question, and the learning that comes away from Columbo is, can you resist giving the answer, and can you ask at least 5 questions? And for those of you who have asked about going across silos or entering a team and working with colleagues and trying to navigate that as a leader, if you can imagine that even though you know the answer, you're sure of the answer, it's black and white, it's right in front of everybody. If you can learn to resist that and ask 5 questions, you will break down silos, you will have constructive value, you're gonna learn a whole lot that you didn't think that you were gonna learn. I got some bum advice early in my career, and the person who I have a lot of respect for said to me, look, you have to write the agenda. You have to write the minutes of every meeting before you write the agenda, meaning you had to construct the output of the meeting before you got there. And I did that for a long time. And it didn't really get me far. And then a colleague said to me, you gotta, it doesn't matter what the outcome of the meeting is. What are they gonna do, like blow up the university or close the hospital? I mean, seriously, like what could possibly go so wrong that you couldn't relax and let the conversation go and ask 5 questions and see where the outcome goes? And that has been an absolute deal changer for me in being able to come into a particularly complex or siloed group and navigate across it. So Columbo on YouTube, that's the homework.
Ericka or Adela, are you good? Or
so I have one. I was trying to find an article that I wanted to mention, and I will find it and send to you, Terry. So hopefully you can share afterwards.
That's great.
But there was something very powerful that I read once, and I think it was published by the Washington Post, and it was something around I think it was the women of Obama or something like that. So very often I find myself being the only woman or the only minority or the only Hispanic person, and I used to allow that to get to me until I understood that the most powerful way of changing things is usually it's not the first person that speaks up, usually it's the second person that supports that innovator. And these women, so there was an article where they wrote about how when they were in the leadership team for the Obama administration, sometimes they would express their ideas and no one would say anything. There would be just crickets, just silence. And then a man would say the exact same idea, and then everybody would say, oh, that is a fantastic idea. This is wonderful. We must act on this. And they didn't allow, of course, there was frustration, but they turned their frustration into innovation. So what they decided to do is when Ericka says something, it doesn't matter if I don't necessarily fully agree, I will not let Ericka's voice go silent. I will say, no, I think it's important to mention what Ericka said. I think let's continue to discuss this. I say this because I think that underneath all of the ideas that we are talking about today, there is a need for us as women to elevate each other. And there is a responsibility we have to each other to not let your voice go silent. I know I have benefited from that. And I've always said that the person that changes things is the second, not the first. It's that second person that is willing to let ego go away. When you think about silos are built on arrogance. When you support someone else and you're willing to be dedicated to someone else's idea, to me, that is where change actually happens.
And I would add to that, I'd say, I think not only are silos built on arrogance, I think a lot of people define leadership as having an edge of arrogance. And leadership can be a lot of things. It can be quiet, it can be soft-spoken, it can be a lot of different things. And so making sure that your leadership style is truly authentic for you, that's what matters the most. Because a good leader also needs to know when you push, when do you pull, when do you coast. You're going to play multiple roles as a leader. It's a dance of a lot of different ways. And sometimes you lead when you're dancing and sometimes you don't. And so, but it's still all leadership at the same time. So don't get caught up in these textbook definitions of what leadership looks like. You build leadership the way you want to build leadership.
excellent. And I think that, as a person who advocates for diverse leadership voices, that's a key element that I constantly push against, because people tend to think leadership has to look one way. And that's why we don't identify as leaders if we don't look that way. And when we begin to see and go back to what are those outcomes that leaders do, and I want to do that, or I do that, then I become a leader. And it's that reframing that is a key aspect of the work at the Institute. But in general, I think all of you are talking about that in this conversation, which is so exciting to me. We have another question, which is actually, it was originally framed for Sandy, but I think it can be relevant to many of you. And that's, Sandy, how, as your role as a professor, and for those of you who may not be professors but have educational roles, which I would argue all of you do, right? How does that influence your leadership as it relates to curiosity and cohesion?
So, as a professor, I take it really seriously. I've taught some of these classes for over 10 years, but right before each semester starts, I go back and do a whole new more current literature review, both to change out the content for the students, but also make sure that if there is new literature on that topic, I'm really current on it. And I'll tell you that has directly impacted my work in leading a startup company. I lead a remote technology startup company. And just as COVID was coming out, I was teaching healthcare finance at the time. And just as COVID was coming out, and all of the information about what was going to change in the telehealth market, both at the federal government and in the payer zone, started to emerge. And so I said to my partner, I think we got to rethink this strategy. And so out of that, because I'm teaching, healthcare economics, I'm reading this stuff for the students, out of that, we completely shifted a piece of our strategy 180 degrees. And as a result, the company is scaling up much more quickly. And so that discipline of being curious, of going online, of looking at sound bites that is in the news and checking that against the scholarly work that's out there has really changed how I lead, for sure.
How about the rest of you? How do you bring in that curiosity and cohesion in your work too? Because again, I think each of you also performs in an educational role as well.
I think you need to meet people where you are, at least in the work that we do. So when you think about it, we are leading change that is not necessarily welcome in South Carolina. And so when you are starting from that perspective, you have to find a way to, I think we all want change to happen immediately, and sometimes change has to happen progressively. And for me, as I grow older, I become more patient, and I understand more that is the only way that sustainable change will happen. Sustainable change happens when it's not me leading it, but it's when I am supporting new leadership and when I am empowering new leaders to use their voices. And in fact, we're working on a leadership, on a fellowship to elevate voices of the unheard, in South Carolina. But you have to know, it's almost an art. You have to know when to push and when to back off a little bit. But I find that having young people in my team allows me not to get complacent. It's so easy to make excuses for not pushing for change because it's inconvenient. And that I absolutely love working with millennials because they keep me honest and they keep me focused on, a lot of my team members want change to happen now. And I find that the healthy tension in between my desire to do it right and their desire to do it now, absolutely the winning combination.
I'd say for me, on one hand, I feel as though part of my responsibility as a leader is to be a coach to my staff, to coach them, even if it means I'm coaching them out of the door. I feel as though that's my responsibility. So I have that on one hand. And then on the other hand, I am a nerd. So I love everything business. I love everything around understanding poverty, social justice issues. So I'm constantly reading, I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly looking for information. And when I put those two things together, it makes me continuously curious and therefore continuously looking for information that I can then share with my team and send their way about certain topics that I'm learning about or certain things that I think apply to the work we're doing and to our organization. And I would say this is probably something I push my team on is being curious and learning and looking for information, because it's always about how we can be better so that we can better the community.
Great. Debora, any final words before I start with the last round?
Yes, just one thing. I think Adela mentioned something very important in one of the questions, that is like the people that are closer to the issue are closer to the solution. I also think that the leader that is closer to the reality of what your business is, if you are in a hospital like Sandy, in this response, and you are really participating in what's happening. If you are in an organization, you really know what's going on. Sometimes I think leaders are detached from the details of the business. And I think as more you know about what your organization, what you are doing, you really can find, and you can lead your team better if you are closer to what's really happening in your organization. So I think that's an important point.
Right, and sometimes those structures or those silos that we put in keep us out of that. So I don't know if, I'm sure that each of you as panelists haven't been able to be monitoring the Q&A or the chat, but several of the comments have said this is the best panel that they've seen on leading in a crisis, and they've seen a lot recently. So kudos to each of you, and thank you very much. Before I get to your last question, we did have a couple questions about the panelists and the future webinars. So we'll be doing our workshop on the communication skills 2 weeks from now. So immediately following this webinar, if you registered for it, you'll get an email with details about how to register for that workshop. That does have limited space, but you have to have seen or viewed the webinar in order to do that. So Tara has posted that in the chat. But you'll also receive an email with information about how to do that. All of our programming for this year is virtual, which, as Ericka indicated, gives us the opportunity to do a little more, right? So I couldn't have had this panel if we weren't pulling virtually, because I have people all over the East Coast in this instance, but in future ones, we have people all over the country coming in. So this is very exciting for us to be able to do that. Subsequent topics are work and life, navigating work and life. That's November's topic. Then we have personal financial management in a time of crisis. How do we keep ourselves financially afloat or stable, particularly given the ups and downs that are going on right now? And then finally, networks and connections. How do we use and build smart networks and those connections? And many of you mentioned that in your comments today, that help us to advance or become the leaders that we want to be. So there's my pitch for that. You'll see more about that in the following. Now, last popcorn, you want one thing that you want to take away, and I'm going to go in reverse order from the way that we started. So Ericka, you're first. What's the one thing that you want people to take away from this as they're developing their own leadership?
Well, I'm not a good rule follower, so I kind of have two, but they're short.
But sometimes breaking the rules is the best way to lead.
Hey, that is true. My first, and one of the things I learned going through this crisis is that I think applies for all women who want to be leaders, is that you belong in this space. You belong in this leadership space. So embrace it and trust yourself. And I think the second thing is that authenticity and vulnerability are not a weakness. They are a strength. They truly can be a strength. So lean into both of those as you develop your own leadership journey. Those would be my two things.
Excellent, excellent. Adela, next.
I'm also not good with rules, but I'll be very quick. So I would say,
I sense a theme.
don't ask permission to lead. There is no better time to lead. Be bold, go for it. Don't ask anyone for permission because you will never get there. Number two, give yourself grace. Be bold and courageous, but if you fail, if you make mistakes, be grateful for the lesson. It will serve you well in the future. And last, which is probably the most important, never close the door behind you. Never. Leave it open and bring others along.
Excellent. Debora.
I would say be yourself. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. I have a colleague that when I joined this leadership position, she told me, I'm very thankful to her. Sometimes we'll be in the doghouse, but we'll get out of the doghouse. So don't be shy. Don't be afraid. Give your opinion. It's your responsibility, even if nobody else agrees with you. But if you really believe that, you need to share that. So be transparent, be yourself.
Excellent. And sometimes women are afraid of the doghouse, so we try to get out of it, but that's actually not the best way, right? All right, Sandy, last kernel.
I would say never attribute to malice that which you can attribute to ignorance. It's our job as women leaders to ask questions and express gratitude.
Wow, excellent. Thank you, all of you, each of you, and also our participants who are online. This is a fabulous beginning to this conversation that we're going to be holding for the rest of the year and hopefully for the rest of our lives, right? Because this doesn't end, as many of you stated, with the crisis that we're continuing to face right now. I hope to see many of you again, and also The bios, again, of each of our panelists will be listed in long form on the Women's Leadership site, so you can get their information and find out more about their fabulous leadership. Thank you all. Have a great day.